Blake Johnson stretched out on his lawn chair, letting the warmth of the afternoon sun melt away his stress. His backyard was his sanctuary, a quiet retreat from the chaos of daily life. The scent of freshly cut grass lingered in the air, mixing with the distant aroma of someone grilling a late lunch. Birds chirped lazily from the branches above, creating a serene melody. He had been waiting for a day like this. A rare moment of peace. No emails, no phone calls, just the simple pleasure of the sun on his skin and the gentle rustling of the wind. Blake sighed contentedly, shifting slightly in his chair to get more comfortable. Just as he was about to close his eyes, a sharp, familiar voice cut through the tranquility like nails on a chalkboard. "Excuse me, what do you think you're doing?" Blake didn't even need to look. He knew that voice. Knew the judgment, the entitlement laced in every word. His peaceful afternoon was officially over. He opened his eyes and turned his head slightly to see his neighbor, Karen, standing at the fence with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her expression was one of exaggerated disapproval, as if she had caught him committing some horrible crime instead of just minding his own business. "I'm sunbathing. On my own property," Blake replied, keeping his tone neutral. He had dealt with Karen's nonsense before, and the last thing he wanted was to give her a reason to escalate things. Karen's lips pursed. "This is a family neighborhood," she said, her voice dripping with condescension. "We don't need people like you loitering around, making us uncomfortable." Blake raised an eyebrow, his patience already wearing thin. "People like me?" Karen bristled but didn't respond directly. Instead, she pulled out her phone, her fingers moving swiftly as she dialed 911. Blake sat up straighter, his stomach twisting in frustration. He had heard the stories before, stories of people being harassed for simply existing in spaces where others thought they didn't belong. He never thought it would happen to him in his own backyard. But here he was, watching his neighbor call the police on him for doing absolutely nothing. Karen's voice was syrupy sweet as she spoke into the phone, masking her malice with faux concern. "Yes, officer, there's a suspicious man in my neighbor's yard," she said, throwing a pointed look at Blake. "I think he might be a criminal." Blake exhaled sharply, shaking his head. "Are you serious right now?" Karen turned her back to him, continuing her call. "Yes, he's trespassing," she added, her tone taking on a sense of urgency. "I don't feel safe." Blake felt his pulse quicken, but he forced himself to stay calm. He knew the truth. He knew this was his home, his land. But would the police see it that way? He had seen how quickly these situations could spiral out of control. How assumptions could turn into accusations. How accusations could lead to something far worse. Minutes later, the distant wail of sirens cut through the air. Blake clenched his jaw as he saw the patrol car turn onto his street, red and blue lights flashing. Two officers stepped out of the cruiser, their hands resting on their belts. The taller officer, a man in his mid-40s with sharp eyes, approached first. "Sir, we received a report of trespassing." Blake took a deep breath, keeping his voice steady. "I live here. I own this house." Karen, emboldened by their presence, pointed a perfectly manicured finger at him. "He's lying. He snuck in, and now he's trying to intimidate me." The second officer, a younger man with a skeptical expression, turned to her. "Ma'am, do you have any proof that he doesn't live here?" Karen hesitated for a split second before scoffing. "I don't need proof. Just look at him." Blake's fists clenched at his sides, but he refused to take the bait. Instead, he pulled his wallet from the side table next to his chair and held up his ID. "Here. Check my address. Or better yet, take a look at my mailbox, my utility bills. I've lived here for years." The officers exchanged a glance. The older one, Officer Martinez, took the ID and examined it carefully. "This address matches," he muttered, nodding slightly. Karen's face turned red. "This is ridiculous." You're just going to believe him. Before either officer could respond, another voice called out from the other side of the fence. Actually, officers, there's something you might want to know about her. Blake turned his head, recognizing the deep, authoritative voice of his other neighbor, Mr. Davidson. And just like that, the situation took an unexpected turn. A hush fell over the tense scene as Mr. Davidson, the neighbor from the other side of the fence, stepped into view. He was a man in his early 50s, with salt and pepper hair and a steady, knowing gaze. Unlike Karen, who was practically vibrating with self-righteousness, Davidson carried himself with calm authority. "Officers, I think you should hear him out," he said, folding his arms as he leaned against the fence. Karen spun around to face him, her face twisted in irritation. "Oh, great. Now you're defending him." Davidson didn't even glance at her. Instead, he focused on the officers. "I'm an FBI agent," he said, flipping open his badge and holding it up for them to see. "I've been living next to Blake for years, and I can tell you with absolute certainty that this is his house." The younger officer's eyes widened slightly, while Martinez took a closer look at Davidson's badge. After a moment, he gave a small nod. Karen's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water. "I don't see what that has to do with." Davidson cut her off. "It has everything to do with it. Because I also know about your past, Karen." The air grew thick with tension. Blake sat up straighter, his curiosity piqued. Karen's face drained of color. I don't know what you're talking about," she stammered. Davidson smirked, shaking his head. "That's funny. Because I recently came across some rather disturbing records. Old files. You wouldn't happen to remember a certain group you used to associate with, would you?" Blake saw the panic flicker in Karen's eyes. She shook her head, stepping back. "This is absurd. These are lies." But Davidson wasn't done. He reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. "Actually, it's all documented. See, once I found out about your affiliations, I did some digging. Turns out, you were more than just a casual supporter." Karen's breath hitched as Davidson tapped his phone screen. "The authorities have been looking into your past activities for a while now. It just so happens that your little stunt today gave me a reason to push forward with my findings. And guess what?" He smirked. "You're in deep trouble." The officers exchanged glances. "What kind of trouble are we talking about?" Martinez asked. Davidson exhaled. "Let's just say Karen here wasn't always just a nosy neighbor. She was an active member of a certain hate group that the FBI has been keeping tabs on for years. And based on what I found, she's got more than a few skeletons in her closet." Blake's jaw clenched. Suddenly, everything made sense. The glares. The microaggressions. The endless attempts to make his life difficult. Karen's bravado crumbled as the officers turned to her. "Ma'am, we're going to have to ask you a few questions," the younger one said, his tone shifting. Karen sputtered. "This is harassment." "He's lying." Davidson chuckled. "Funny, that's what Blake could have said about you 5 minutes ago." Karen's hands trembled as she clutched her phone, looking around as if searching for an escape. But there was none. The officers were now focused entirely on her, and Davidson wasn't backing down. "I don't know what you think you found, but this is slander." Karen snapped. Davidson remained calm. "You can call it whatever you want. The FBI calls it a pattern of extremist activity. I have records of your past meetings, affiliations, and, let's not forget, the documented harassment of minorities in your previous neighborhoods." Blake felt a knot in his stomach. He had suspected Karen was prejudiced, but he had no idea it went this deep. Officer Martinez turned to Davidson. "Can you send us those records?" Davidson nodded, already swiping through his phone. "Forwarding them now." Karen's panic intensified. "Wait, you can't just, I haven't done anything wrong. Blake let out a humorless laugh. Nothing wrong. You called the cops on me for existing in my own yard. What else have you done to people like me? Karen's mouth snapped shut. The younger officer's radio crackled. He pressed his hand to his earpiece and listened for a moment before exchanging another glance with Martinez. We need to bring her in for questioning. There's enough here to warrant an investigation. Blake watched as Karen's face twisted with rage, then desperation. You can't do this. I pay my taxes. I have rights. Martinez sighed. And so does Blake. Yet you were ready to have him arrested based on nothing. He stepped forward. Ma'am, please turn around. Karen's breath came in short gasps as she backed away. No. This isn't fair. But it was too late. The officers moved in, securing her hands behind her back as she continued to protest. As they walked her toward the patrol car, she turned one last time to glare at Blake. This isn't over, she hissed. Blake just shook his head. It is for you. The door slammed shut, and the car pulled away. Davidson let out a low whistle. Well, that was dramatic. Blake chuckled, though his nerves were still buzzing. You knew about her past this whole time? Suspected it. Confirmed it when I started digging. Davidson crossed his arms. People like her always slip up eventually. Blake exhaled, glancing up at the clear blue sky. The day had started with peace, was interrupted by chaos, and had somehow ended with justice. Thanks, man, he said, nodding toward Davidson. Davidson smirked. Anytime. Now go enjoy the rest of your sunbathing. You've earned it. Blake grinned, reclining in his chair once again. This time, no one would be bothering him. The news of Karen's arrest spread through the neighborhood like wildfire. By the next morning, people were talking. Some whispered about the incident over fences, others gossiped in hushed voices at the local coffee shop. A few neighbors, ones who had always kept their distance from Blake, suddenly started offering polite nods when they passed by. Blake wasn't sure how to feel about it. It was strange, seeing people realize what had been so obvious to him for years. Karen had been a problem long before she called the cops on him. This was just the first time she got caught. Sitting on his porch with a cup of coffee, he scrolled through his phone. Social media was already buzzing. Someone had recorded the incident from their window, and the video was spreading fast. Comments poured in. Some were outraged by Karen's actions. Others were shocked by the revelation of her past. A few, of course, tried to defend her. Blake sighed, rubbing his temple. He never asked for any of this. He just wanted to enjoy his own backyard without drama. But at least now, he wouldn't have to look over his shoulder every time he stepped outside. A sudden knock on his door pulled him from his thoughts. Opening it, he found Mr. Davidson standing there, holding 2 cups of coffee. Figured you could use an extra one. Blake smirked, taking the cup. You figured right. Davidson leaned against the doorframe. You all right? Blake took a sip before answering. I don't know. It's weird. I never thought she'd actually face consequences. Davidson nodded. People like her usually don't. But this time, she messed with the wrong person. He paused. The FBI's looking into everything now. Turns out, Karen wasn't just a passive supporter of that group. She was actively involved in some serious things. Blake raised an eyebrow. Serious how? Davidson sighed. Let's just say, if everything checks out, she won't be coming back here anytime soon. Blake exhaled. The weight of years of silent tension, of being treated as an outsider in his own home, started to lift. Good, he muttered. A few weeks later, Karen's case made headlines. Reports confirmed what Davidson had hinted at: she had been deeply involved in illegal activities linked to extremist groups. Her past had finally caught up to her. Blake watched the news one evening, shaking his head as the reporter detailed the charges. It was surreal. The same woman who had called the cops on him for sunbathing in his own backyard was now facing 10 years in prison. The neighborhood had changed, too. Without Karen stirring up trouble, things felt lighter. People were more relaxed. A few neighbors even came by to formally apologize for not stepping in sooner. Blake appreciated it, though he wasn't looking for an apology. He just wanted to live in peace. And now, finally, he could. One afternoon, as he stretched out in his backyard, soaking up the sun without a care in the world, he heard the sound of a lawn chair unfolding next door. Looking over, he saw Davidson settling in with a book. The older man lifted his coffee cup in a silent toast. Blake chuckled, raising his own glass of iced tea in return. For the first time in a long time, he felt at home. And this time, no one was going to take that away from him. A few weeks later, Karen's case made headlines. Reports confirmed what Davidson had hinted at: she had been deeply involved in illegal activities linked to extremist groups. Her past had finally caught up to her. Blake watched the news one evening, shaking his head as the reporter detailed the charges. It was surreal. The same woman who had called the cops on him for sunbathing in his own backyard was now facing 10 years in prison. The neighborhood had changed, too. Without Karen stirring up trouble, things felt lighter. People were more relaxed. A few neighbors even came by to formally apologize for not stepping in sooner. Blake appreciated it, though he wasn't looking for an apology. One afternoon, as he stretched out in his backyard, soaking up the sun without a care in the world, he heard the sound of a lawn chair unfolding next door. For the first time in a long time, he felt at home. And this time, no one was going to take that away from him.